Today, let us talk about the meaning and definition of displaced persons. Displaced persons, which come under the category of forced migration, are among the world's most vulnerable people. Migrants reporting natural disaster, social or political problems, and displacement by development project as their reasons for migration have been categorized as forced migrants. According to Human Development Report 2009, those who are forced to flee and leave behind their homes and belongings often go into the process with limited freedom and very few resources. Forced migration has accompanied persecution as well as war throughout human history, but has only become a topic of serious study and discussion relatively recently. This increased attention is the result of greater ease of travel, allowing displaced persons to flee to nations far removed from their homes, the creation of an international legal structure of human rights, and the realizations that the destabilizing effects of forced migration ripple out well beyond the immediate region. International Association for the Study of Forced Migration has defined forced migration as a general term that refers to the movements of refugees and internally displaced people, that is, those displaced by conflicts, as well as people displaced by natural or environmental disasters, chemical or nuclear disasters, famine, or development projects. Displacement can be categorized into three types according to their causal factors. They are as follows. Firstly, conflict-induced displacement. Secondly, development-induced displacement. And thirdly, disaster-induced displacement. Let us first talk about the conflict-induced displacement. Conflict-induced displacement occurs when people are forced to flee their homes as a result of armed conflict, including civil war, generalized violence, and persecution on the grounds of nationality, race, religion, political opinion, or social group. A large proportion of these displaced people will flee across international borders in search of refuge. Some of them may seek asylum under international law, whereas others may prefer to remain anonymous, perhaps fearing that they may not be granted asylum and will be returned to the country from whence they fled. Since the end of the Cold War, there has been an escalation in the number of armed conflicts around the world. Many of these more recent conflicts have been internal conflicts based on national, ethnic, or religious separatist struggles. There has been a large increase in the number of refugees during the period as displacement has increasingly become a strategic tactic often used by all sides in the conflict. Since the end of the Cold War, there has also been an even more dramatic increase in the number of internally displaced persons, who currently far outnumber the world's refugee population. Now coming to development-induced displacement. Development-induced displacement occurs when people are compelled to move as a result of policies and projects implemented to advance development efforts. Examples of this include large-scale infrastructure projects such as dams, roads, ports, airports, urban clearance initiatives, mining and deforestation, and the introduction of conservation parks or reserves and biosphere projects. Affected people usually remain within the borders of their home country. Although some are resettled, evidence clearly shows that very few of them are adequately compensated. While there are guidelines on restoration for affected populations produced by some major donors to these types of projects, such as the World Bank, there continues to be inadequate access to compensation. This tends to be the responsibility of host governments, and interventions from outside and often deemed inappropriate. This is undoubtedly a casual factor in displacement more often than armed conflict, although it often takes place with little recognition, support, or assistance from outside the affected population. Thirdly, disaster-induced displacement. Disaster-induced displacement occurs when people are displaced as a result of natural disasters such as floods, volcanoes, landslides, earthquakes, environmental change such as deforestation, desertification, land degradation, global warming, and human-made disasters. Human-made disasters can be interpreted broadly and used to encompass many different types of disasters. Train crashes such as the one that killed over 200 people in Tanzania in June 2002 is one example of a human-made disaster. Long-term human-made disasters tend to refer to civil strife, civil war, and international war. Clearly, there is a good deal of overlap between these different types of disaster-induced displacement. For example, the impact of floods and landslides can be greatly exacerbated by deforestation and agricultural activities. Estimating trends and global figures on people displaced by disaster is even more disputed and problematic than for the other two categories. But there are certainly many millions of people displaced by disasters every year. Rationale and genesis of internally displaced persons. The need for international standards for the protection of internally displaced persons became apparent in the 1990s when the number of people uprooted within their own countries by armed conflict, ethnic strife, and human rights abuses began to soar. The fact of being displaced from their homes makes IDPs particularly vulnerable to human rights abuses and neglect. Concern over the vulnerability of IDPs led the UN Commission on Human Rights to ask the representative on IDPs, Francis Dang, to examine the extent to which existing international law provides adequate coverage for IDPs 1992 and to develop an appropriate framework for IDPs 1996. Accordingly, the representative, with the support of a team of international legal experts, formulated the guiding principles on internal displacement, which were presented to the Commission in 1998. In line with international human rights and humanitarian law and with refugee law by analogy, The 30 principles set out the rights and guarantees relevant to the protection of IDPs in all phases of displacement, providing protection against arbitrary displacement, protection and assistance during displacement, and during return or internal resettlement and reintegration. The principles provide guidance to all relevant factors. The representative, in carrying out his mandate, states when faced with the phenomenon of internal displacement, all other authorities, including de facto authorities, groups and persons in their relations with IDPs, and intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. The principles establish that IDPs must not be discriminated against simply because of their displacement or because of their race, sex, language, religion, social origin, or some similar factors. The principles restate the right not to be arbitrarily displaced and prohibit displacement on ethnic, religious, or social grounds. The principles reaffirm that national authorities have the obligation to ensure that IDPs' basic rights to food, water, shelter, dignity, and safety are met. They should accept the assistance of the international community where they do not have the capacity to provide assistance and protection to IDPs. IDPs have also the right to seek asylum in another country. In the return phase, the principles emphasize the importance of voluntary and safe return as well as the need to assist the displaced to recover their property and possessions. Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, Para 2 of a United Nations report defines internally displaced persons as persons or group of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflicts, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. It is, however, important to note that rather than a strict definition, the guiding principles offer a descriptive identification of the category of persons whose needs are the concern of the guiding principles. In this way, the document intentionally steers towards flexibility rather than legal precision, as the words "in particular" indicates that the list of reasons for displacement is not exhaustive. The definition given by the guiding principles stresses two important elements. They are, firstly, the coercive or otherwise involuntary character of movement. The definition mentions some of the most common causes of involuntary movements such as armed conflict, violence, human rights violence, and disasters. These causes have in common that they give no choice to people but to leave their homes and deprive them of the most essential protection mechanisms such as community networks, access to services, livelihoods. Displacement severely affects the physical, socio-economic and legal safety of people and should be systematically regarded as an indicator of potential vulnerability. Secondly, the fact that such movement takes place within national borders. Unlike refugees who have been deprived of the protection of their state of origin, IDPs remain legally under the protection of national authorities of their country of habitual residence. IDPs should therefore enjoy the same rights as the rest of the population. The guiding principles on internal displacement remind national authorities and other relevant actors of their responsibility to ensure that IDPs' rights are respected and fulfilled despite the vulnerability generated by their displacement. The phrases contained in the definitions persons or group of persons implies displacement can affect persons in particular or an entire group. Forced or obliged covers a range of possibilities of being expelled by forces or intimidated to leave by threat or necessity. The most important fact is that displacement is coerced or involuntary. To flee or to leave implies displacement does not only include movements of people running away from an immediate danger, but also can take the form of more prepared and organized departures in anticipation of dangers, evictions, etc. As a result of or in order to avoid the effect implies effects that have already taken place and the expected fear that these effects are going to take place. Places of habitual residence implies that habitual residence is not necessarily a house or a building but can be land on which groups traditionally live, as in the case of pastoralists. The United Nations guiding principles address the specific needs of internally displaced persons worldwide. They identify rights and guarantees relevant to the protection of persons from forced displacement and to their protection and assistance during displacement as well as during return or resettlement and reintegration. These principles reflect and are consistent with international human rights law and international humanitarian law. They provide guidance to the representative of the Secretary General on internally displaced persons in carrying out his mandate, states when faced with the phenomenon of internal displacement, all other authorities, groups and persons in their relations with internally displaced persons, and intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations when addressing internal displacement. Section 1, which consists of Principle 1 to Principle 4, deals with general principles. Section 2, which consists of Principle 5 to 9, deals with principles relating to protection from displacement. Section 3, which consists of Principle 10 to 23, deals with principles relating to protection during displacement. Section 4, which consists of Principle 24 to 27, deals with principles relating to humanitarian assistance. Section 5, which consists of Principle 28 to 30, deals with principles relating to return, resettlement, and reintegration. Displacement, which comes under the category of forced migration, renders people affected by it more vulnerable to specific risk. The social organization of displaced communities may have been destroyed or damaged by the act of physical displacement. Family groups may be separated or disrupted. Women may be forced to assume non-traditional roles or face particular vulnerabilities. Internally displaced populations may experience profound psychosocial distress related to displacement. Removal from sources of income and livelihood may add to physical and psychosocial vulnerability for displaced people. Schooling for children and adolescents may be disrupted. Internal displacement to areas where host populations are of different groups or inhospitable may increase risk to internally displaced communities. Internally displaced persons may face language barriers during displacement. The condition of internal displacement may raise the suspicions of or lead to abuse by armed combatants or other parties to conflict. IDPs may lack identity documents essential to receiving benefits or legal recognition. In some cases, fearing persecution, displaced persons have sometimes got rid of such documents. In the last decade of the 20th century, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights became increasingly concerned with the vulnerabilities of the displaced persons, particularly to neglect and human rights abuses. Accordingly, the representative on IDPs, Francis Deng, along with the support of a team of international legal experts, formulated the guiding principles on internal displacement, which were presented to the Commission in 1998. The United Nations Guiding Principles on IDPs have given a framework for taking care and providing adequate protection of those affected by internal displacement. It defines IDPs as persons or group of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflicts, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. The framework of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, which consisted of 30 principles grouped under 5 categories, addressed all 3 phases of internal displacement: the pre-displacement, situation during displacement, and the post-displacement, that is, the return and resettlement of the displacee. These measures are necessary to reduce risk during displacement and to promote durable solutions without prejudice to other populations of humanitarian concern. Thank you.